world, and welcome to another episode of the South African Spice podcast. Today, I'm going to need all my calm, cool, and collectedness because the little girl in me can't control her excitement for our guest today. Now, this conversation was truly enlightening, informative, and just a really fun experience. We could have spoken for hours on end, which is why I really hope you enjoy part one. She is a mom, wife, daughter, comedian, MC, award-winning director, performer, and writer. And if we're really throwing it back, she's also former Miss India South Africa. Wow, that's a complete mouthful, but obviously I'm talking about Krijay Govender. So hi Krijay, and welcome to the South African Spice podcast.
Hi Alicia, I'm really excited to be on.
We're so excited to have you here. I think everybody who I've spoken to, my generation, is equally excited. But the younger folk, they know your name, but they don't really know, kind of too much about you. So I think the best way to start this off is, can you please just, give us a little introduction for the generations who should know exactly who you are?
It's not just the younger generation. I have so often walked around South Africa with people says, I know you from somewhere. And so often I say, before I can say anything, they'll go, don't you work at ABSA? Or the most embarrassing one is there was an older Indian lady that said to me, I know you from somewhere. And then I was like, yeah, probably TV. And then she says, no, aren't you related to my nephews? And I was like, yes, I am. So wherever one tries to blow one's own trumpet, I find that it's always muted. So who am I? Previously, I would say I'm a very proud South African of Indian origin. And I'm telling you why, because I think the whole world is shifted and I've shifted. And that's why I'm so excited for you and for people that are living abroad, because I think the world has changed and it's wonderful to have South African roots, but also I now see myself as a citizen of the world first. And I get so excited when I find out that South African Indians particularly are doing well abroad. There's a sense of pride in me, the kind of pride that maybe our parents and grandparents had when they found out that Indians were doing well throughout the world. But for me now, I think that's shifted to South African Indians living and plowing into a global space than just South Africa. Because South Africa is a very troubled space at the moment. And we can't just keep saying, oh, we're so excited and proud to be South African. I think that's on a very, maybe a sort of spiritual level that we are, but on a practical level, we're kind of embarrassed at the moment.
Or maybe even a nostalgic level for what we remember it to be.
Yes. Nostalgic level, especially for you guys, because you're away, but for the rest of us, nostalgic in the sense that everybody kind of dreams of Mandela, Thabo Mbeki days, where intelligent conversations were happening and where we all really felt a part of the nation. And now we see not just us, but various groups kind of being marginalized, and we're trying to actively get back involved to sort of wave our South African flag identity again. And it's difficult because it's difficult when infrastructure is collapsing around you. You know what I mean? It really is. Oh, I've gone too deep. I was talking about who I am. And then I think what's become more important to me as I get older is maybe my religious identity. I'm a South African Indian Christian, and I've always been Christian. I'm born to Vijaya Lakshmi and Krishna Swami, two very Hindu names, who converted on their wedding honeymoon, right? I could say they had a very holy experience on their honeymoon, but I would get into trouble for that joke with them. But they converted on their honeymoon to Christianity. My parents went down to Cape Town. They drove down to Cape Town on their honeymoon. And my dad was drowning. And my dad, for some reason, he was drowning and the lifeguards couldn't get to him. And so he called out to Jesus. And he said, Jesus, please save me and I'll commit my life to thee, which, as we know, is not a typical line for any person to say, because it's quite old English and, it's probably English in the King James version of the Bible and in Shakespeare. So my dad said that, which was bizarre for him. And later on that day, a big wave came and saved him. And then they converted to Christianity, and they obviously had a lot of issues with their family at that time, because these two people had a wedding, went to Cape Town, came back and kind of said, that's it, we're converting to Christianity, which was very odd.
Usually with religion, this would happen.
That's it. And then I was brought up by my grandmother, who was Hindu. And whenever I speak about myself, I cannot not speak about my grandmother, because she was a huge influence in my life. I didn't grow up with my parents. My parents grew up in Shallcross, and I grew up in North Dean. And so what was interesting about that was my grandmother was Hindu, but she respected my dad's wishes that I remained a Christian. So we all grew up. I grew up with loads of cousins. All of us lived at my grand's house, because our parents grew up during apartheid. So they were trying to all make it in life. And both my parents worked. So I really respected my grandmother. When I look back, she respected my parents enough to kind of bring me up as a Christian child in a Hindu household. What I love about my parents is that from a very, very early age, they had a very clear sense of the difference between culture and religion. So my parents are strongly, always outwardly and possibly inwardly, reflected a very Indian identity. So even when they converted, they refused to change their names, because that's who they are. And the names, names are so important.
Yeah.
Because names are given to you by your parents. You know what I mean? And then they made it very clear. And I remember my parents sending me to Tamil school when I was little. And the Tamil school teacher had a bigger problem. She was too short-sighted to understand that my parents wanted me to learn Tamil. And my parents were, if you're doing any prayer or anything, just exclude her. And you won't remember this, but probably your mum would. But Tamil school teachers back in the day they were just hitless. They just hit for everything, and you kind of just learned what you learned off by route, Anna, Abina, and all of that, and without even an understanding of what you were learning. So thank goodness for Duolingo now. So I was very excited about my parents, because I felt that they were, now when I look back, extremely progressive to get us to not to become Western, but to keep your Indian identity, to understand that the religion is a way in which we choose to worship God. And that's a very personal thing. And then it took a lot of growing up for me to understand that, especially when I was Miss India, South Africa. I know there were a lot of nasty back then. Thank goodness there was no such thing as Twitter and all of those things. I wouldn't have managed. There were quite a few nasty letters that I used to see in the newspaper saying, oh, but she's Christian. But now I wanted to explain, and I didn't then have perhaps the right articulation and vocabulary to explain that we are multifaceted in our identity. And you guys living abroad, even more so now, because you've got to explain to the whole world, well, I am South African, I am Indian, I am either Christian or Muslim or Buddhist or, and I don't speak any of the languages.
Exactly.
But I can speak a little bit of Afrikaans and a little bit of Zulu and very good English, by the way. So identity is extremely multifaceted. And as I grew older, I kind of understood that, and very grateful to my parents for making sure that I knew the differences, because it's very important for us to belong. If you don't belong, you get lonely, and that is
lost.
Very
lost.
But you've got to carve out your own identity and make sure that people respect that identity, whatever it is. And then, of course, there's a huge part of me that's an artist. Not so much an actress anymore, but more of a director, which is a very, very different view on creativity and writing and producing shows. And then comedy is something that I don't do stand up right now, because I think my kids, my kids experience a very different mother to the comedian. In fact, one of them actually said to me, if anybody could see you right now, there is no part of you that's actually funny, Mom. And I said, that's right. You're not paying me. I'm not doing a comedy set. I'm your mum. And I'm very sad to say that I have become such a typical Indian parent. You know what I mean? I kind of read literature on parenting and everything, but I have repeated every line that I promised I would never do. And I think I've been even more forceful, to the extent that one of my children, my eldest daughter just turned 18. I have a 14-year-old. No, maybe she's 15. I can't remember. I must just check. And then there's a 9-year-old boy who just turned 9. So there's quite a gap between them. But the 18-year-old has just gone to university. And there was a panic inside of me because she wanted to study music. And we've kind of put her in, and we said to her, what are the other options? You know, you can always study. Can you see all of the things that my parents didn't even do to me? I mean, when I wanted to do drama at university, they just allowed me. And suddenly I'm kind of going back to the so-called fallback plan.
Yep.
So I would say I'm an afraid mother, but I'm a brilliant actress in that department. I'm a very supportive wife because I've genuinely understood that if you are in a marriage, you've got to relook at all your your feminist ideas. And actually, I understand that it's a partnership.
Yeah.
It really is a partnership. I hate compromising in life, but I do compromise quite a bit. And then I'm always right in a marriage. I really am. I think most females are.
Naturally.
Naturally. And I think I've learned the art to make ideas seem like my husband's ideas.
That is a skill I'm learning, grows as your marriage grows. You kind
Absolutely.
of, you own that skill.
And then I think it's also very important, which I've kind of learned the hard way, not to tear husbands and wives down. You know what I mean? And the huge importance, particularly in our community, of us being progressive. I'm talking about the wives, progressive enough not to have the same. I couldn't stand those issues of in-laws issues. You know, it really bugged me. And so consciously, as a wife, I have decided very early that I'm not going to have those same kind of issues that generally play out in Indian communities where there's an in-law issue. And I've found that I've opened up quite a bit to my husband's family very early in my marriage to say, hey, everybody's welcome. And I do enjoy being on all their family chats and all of that. And that's quite important. I know I'm talking about marriage now, but that's quite important, bringing it back to who I am, because nobody tells you this, you know. Yeah. We kind of do the degree and we do the career, and nobody tells you how important that aspect of your life becomes and how important that aspect of your life is to give you the freedom to do what you want. You know what I mean?
I think it's part of like one of the, you know, conversations that is also going to form part of this podcast is the fact that in our community, you get told you must get married. Like, when are you getting married? Get married. But nobody really tells you what marriage is. And then you don't understand when you have these issues. That's the one part of it. But then the second part of it is, you know, everybody's like, oh, you're marrying into this family and stuff. But when you are open-minded enough to actually look at it and then you realize these are two families coming together in a way. And it's up to you as the joining couple who's making that happen to decide how this goes.
Absolutely. You've absolutely hit it on the head. And I'll tell you what it is. I used to also be a big critic of, oh, you must get married. And why don't these people just leave us alone? Because also I got married pretty late. I got married at 28, which is considered quite late. But I think now, you know, those that get married in their 30s are also considered. But I understand that it's coming from a good place now that I'm older. And it's because people don't want you to be alone and they want you to have companionship. You know, there's so much in the world that makes you lonely. And I think the other part of it is, and I hope there's a reversal for all of us that, you know, once you find the person, for heaven's sake, start the journey. Because particularly in the South African Indian community, the men die off earlier. Yeah. And, you know, we have far more widows left, you know, so their journey is very limited in terms of time, you know. And it's because, I'll tell you what a doctor said to me, well, I'm going way off topic. But he said to me, did you know that the South African Indian community is the only community that when they cook a mutton curry and a chicken curry, we have to have potatoes in there. And when you look at that meal, we have got rice or roti and a potato. So he's like, you've got 2 carbs. Whereas every other meal, you know, doesn't have 2 carbs. Most cultures don't. Even the Indian mutton curry or rogan dash and all those words that they don't have 2 carbs. So he said to me, Krijay, do you understand why we have such a problem with heart disease and all of that? It's because we have 2 carbs. And you know what I said to him? I said, you're absolutely right. But if you think I'm going to stop...
Okay, yes, I'll acknowledge it, but it's not going to change.
It's not going to change. You know, I'll run a little extra, but it's not going to change. But he made a very good point. So bringing it back to companionship. So I used to as well when I was younger go, I wish these older people would leave us alone. And now I've become one of those older people that when I see a young couple kind of, why aren't you getting married? I think our point is start. And it does, especially people listening to your podcast who meet somebody, even if they're not South African Indian, is not, we all look for commonalities in partners, but when there's a spark of love, go for it, start the journey. And I've become a big believer in marriage because it really is a commitment. Somebody once said to me in a card when I got married, and I remembered it, that marriage is actually a warm fire at the end of a hard day on a cold night that you can come to. And it's very difficult. And I don't believe in working on it and all of that. I don't think you'd have to actively work on it. You have to consciously work on yourself, not the marriage. Both of you have to consciously work on yourself.
Yeah.
I've digressed into who I am. But anyway, directing in South Africa, the reason I went into directing is a very sad reason actually for a South African Indian. And that sad reason is there's just not enough roles for South African Indian actors. And we were kind of getting tired of every time we got cast into roles for arranged marriages, which absolutely didn't reflect our generation or even our parents' generation. You know what I mean?
That
Absolutely.
is very focused, Bollywood centered.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a beauty in growing up as a South African Indian. There really is. And it's something that maybe I'll one day, if I get a chance, put in a movie. And that is, we've really come from a lineage of chance takers. I mean, to get on a ship, not to have a picture, TikTok, Instagram image of where you're going.
Or even Google, for that matter.
Nothing. You had no picture. You had words. You know what I mean? You either had to be a huge risk taker and an adventurer or a criminal trying to get away from India. And when you look at that past, and people like Ashwin Desai and all of that write about those things, if you look at that past of the 1860 settlers, that's where I get proud and nostalgic, but very proud. Because then I'm going, listen, the adventure spirit and the survival spirit are those Indians that moved from India. And that's where we come from. And so you'll know that South African Indians put a huge emphasis on education and getting the degree and all of that. But they also, the other part of South African Indians that I've seen is desperately want to build South Africa. And nobody gets that we desperately want to build South Africa because it's home. And the link to India and to all I'm sure all diasporic communities feel this way, but we feel it because we had apartheid. So when you got here, there was an extra environment to deal with of oppression, and nobody gets that. And that's the part that I'm really proud of. And I also lots and lots of unsung heroes. I mean, I know you speak to me because I'm quite visible in terms of being in the entertainment industry. But if you look at the South African Indians that have been in education, and what they've done for this country, and in business, and what they've done for this country, we don't celebrate those people enough.
Just because it's not glamorous. It's not the glamorous picture that you want to have out there.
Yeah. So the work ethic of South African Indians is also something that I always celebrate. But what's great about it, as I said this to you as well, Alicia, before we started, is that, I'm just so excited that South African Indians are moving away. And whether you come back or not, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter. It's just because I know that the grounding of South African Indians is pretty solid in being decent human beings and in what they would offer the world. Because there's a lot of history, oppression, and there's most importantly, a lot of overcoming in that. A lot of overcoming.
Yeah, and there's a fight. There's a fight to constantly, I think no matter what generation you are, there is a fight to want to be successful in your own right. I think that vision of what success looks like is changing generation by generation, but there is a fight and a want to be successful.
Yes, and it's a fighting spirit. It really is a fighting spirit, which is great, but I also think we need to grow from that fighting spirit and let it be far more of a generous spirit. Leave the fighting spirit should have stayed with the guys that democratized our country. And now my generation, and more so your generation, needs to have, a foundation of a fighting spirit to make it, but also a spirit of generosity. I'll give you an example of something that happened and how my dad just kind of opened my eyes to how ridiculous I was being. I was writing for the newspaper back then when people read the newspaper, and I was living in Durban. So now I'm living in Johannesburg for, I think, 22 years. And I'll talk about that as well, because I find that fascinating, living in Johannesburg, because you guys are an extension of that. You kind of all, left Durban, which is kind of like the mothership, and then moved to Johannesburg, and then people that have moved abroad. But when I was writing for the newspaper in Durban, it was daily news. And I wrote a column about, I'd met an older white man at an event. This was in the mid to late 90s. And the guy asked me about curry. He said, oh, curry is my favorite thing. And I wrote such a nasty article saying that when this man saw me at this event, and it was small talk, he said to me, oh, I really like curry. And, and then I exchanged some kind words to him. But the whole time inside I was seething. I'm like, that's what you see? You see a pot when you see me? Anyway, I wrote this article and I got so much praise about this article. And then my dad read the article and he called me in and he said, you should be ashamed of yourself. And I was like, oh my gosh, what have I done? Because, I was so proud of this article, and I used a really good vocabulary on identity politics and all of that in that article. Even the professors at university had read it and they said, well done. And then my dad said to me, that man didn't need to speak to you at all. He was looking for some kind of connection to speak to this person. And the connection that he went to was food, because that's the only thing he kind of knows about Indian people. So it took a lot of courage on his part to come and talk to you, Miss Arrogant Know-It-All. And instead of accepting that and then extending the conversation to something else and maybe telling him something else about you as a South African Indian, you came home and you wrote this article about how racist the man was because he saw you when he spoke about curry. I was really ashamed. And the more I look at it, the more I went, actually, you're right. The man could have ignored me and not had the conversation. And that's what I'm talking about when I say we need to have a fighter spirit, but we need to be careful that we're not becoming like what the Americans are becoming, which is extremely polarized, and everything about them is their politics. We need to have a generous, intelligent, well thought out spirit, especially when you're communicating with people, and give them the benefit of the doubt.
You say that, and that reminds me so much of the experiences like we've had now being abroad, and I think other South African Indians have had being abroad, where you identify and people look at you, other Indian people find you, and they look at you and they automatically think like you're Indian. That to them is also relatable. It's the same thing when us as Indian people in South Africa go to any place and we're like, oh my God, there's other Indian people here? Wow, this is amazing. It's the same kind of thing, but I think I've done a lot of, not reflecting, but I've looked at that kind of situation happening, and it really frustrated me because I was like, why don't you understand that I am from South Africa? Like, don't you know about your own history? Like, how do you not know that Indian people ended up in South Africa? Why are you always trying to like link me back? And the more conversations I've had and the more times I've spoken about it, the more I've realized that it's not their fault that they don't have that knowledge, but it is my fault for not wanting to have a progressive conversation and really give them that information.
Absolutely. And you've got to do it in a very funny way. So my default is comedy. And then I use examples, like, for example, you know the level of intelligence of somebody when you're speaking to them. And then I'll always say to people, do you know how you have African Americans who call themselves African Americans, but they've got no link to Africa? We are the same. We are Indian South Africans. And then I talk about the largest population of Indians outside of India. You just got to throw in the key words, Nelson Mandela, apartheid, and largest population of Indians. And then after that, then you get all the other questions that South African gets, which is the animals.
Or you just leave them to like go on their devices and like do your research, look up something. Now you're going to like educate yourself. But then yes, it does lead to all the animal questions. And for the Indian people specifically, I love to say that I have my own elephant.
Who doesn't? I mean, don't you guys have it in India? Don't you have your own elephant? we have ours. The animal question it really, I've just never understood it ever, but it just keeps coming. And then also the heat, in Africa. And then just realize that we know very little, for example, of Kazakhstan. And if you meet a Kazakh, so that when that happens, then you kind of put it in perspective. Not everybody knows our incredible history. And beyond Nelson Mandela and I think a couple of soccer players, there's very little information that people really know about South Africa.
And rugby team.
You know, talking about
Basically.
rugby, can I just say what's fascinated me about rugby is the unifying ability of that particular sport in this country in recent years. In the 90s, rugby was still something that everybody said, okay, you know, it was only a sport that white South Africans watched. And then suddenly there's the sport that, I mean, I never understood rugby and I never bothered with it. And it happened with rugby itself because rugby transformed itself with Sia and with other guys, you know, themselves becoming kind of the face of rugby. But even just to watch the way in which in South Africa, I tell you what we celebrate and what we love, things that work. And actually rugby works. You know what I mean?
It works well.
It works well. And that documentary, Chasing the Sun, is just an incredible documentary to show you that. And suddenly I found myself, and I'm not a fan that much of provincial rugby, but I've noticed more people have become fans of provincial rugby. I mean, I kind of like to watch I like the drama. So I watch the international games or when they're playing the All Blacks or all of that. And then you watch the other side, which is the way in which cricket is kind of trying to claw its way out of problems and issues and reputation in South Africa. So the thing is, I won't say everybody just loves a winner, but in South Africa particularly, we are at that stage. If something works, we love it, you know, because
we're behind
works.
it completely.
Yeah. I have met Indian rugby players, South African Indian boys. Oh my word. Just wait, watch this space. In the coming years, you're going to get a couple of real what could I say? A couple of real common and I use that in inverted commas, surnames like Govender, like my surname, which by the way, I want to talk about my surname because my surname doesn't exist in India, as you know. And I've embraced that. And I've had to explain it to my sister who when she moved to London, and she's lived abroad now for many, many years. But when she moved to London initially, she was really upset because the officer at immigration there said to her, "You're not Indian and this is not an Indian surname." And so she was very young at that stage. She's like 7 years younger than I, but at that stage when she'd moved to London, she argued that point. And then she phoned me and she's like, "Can you believe this idiot? He's saying to me that Govender is not an Indian surname." I'm like, "Actually, my sister's name is Jemima. That's not an Indian name. My name is, but hers isn't." So I said, "Jemima, he's right. It's not an Indian surname. The real name was Govender, and you know that when they were at the border posts, they anglicized it like lavender to Govender, and that's it. So just embrace it. If you want to change back to Govinda, you can, but it's not just a South African Indian problem. I mean, it's happened to the Irish. It's happened to all communities that have been shifted around the world. So, and that's nice, and I think it's important to embrace that's what it is. That's our history. So let's go with it." So I have met some 17 and 18-year-olds that are playing in the junior league that are going to come up. So watch that space. There are going to be some interesting names.
That's really exciting, especially for me personally, because I've got 3 nephews and they went to a school in, my youngest is still in school, but they play rugby in their school because soccer wasn't available. But they actually were like Indian boys, first Indian boys in our family and that our friends and families have heard of. And they were like, "Indian boys don't play rugby." And we're like, actually, they play and they're really good and they all made first team. So we're really proud of them for getting this far.
Okay, let's call a spade a spade. I mean, those Indian legs are not, they're not rugby legs, okay? But what I've learned in rugby is that you don't have to be, I've learned that there's different positions.
Yeah.
And then there are some really big Indian guys anyway, some really big boys that are coming up. And the 2 that I've met that I won't mention right now because I didn't get any permission or something, but the 2 that I've met, I was so impressed. I mean, they're giants and they're going to become giants in more ways than one. So I hope they get those opportunities.
I really hope so too, because that would be really nice to see. Like, you know, you've been saying, we chatted now about rugby and how it's evolved as a sport. And it's also evolved in giving chances to people of color. And I think as much as the whole nation is always behind our rugby team because they just do so well, it would also be nice to have, like, you know, our communities have something to relate to, because right now we're looking at the kids of color on that team and we're supporting them as much as we're supporting, the rest of the team. But I think there's just like that extra oomph that you get when you see that opportunity given to people of your own color.
And it's important to reflect the society that we live in, which, by the way, we don't in South Africa, particularly with advertising. It irritates me that we don't, because South African Indian buying power is generally quite large. But I've noticed that there's been kind of like a sidelining of our faces in ads. And then something else about rugby, because we're talking about supportive and how things work. Watching those documentaries, and now particularly because I'm directing a show called Champions, which is a telenovela about soccer. And the difference that I've seen, because we had to do quite a bit of research with soccer players. I mean, soccer players, their careers are so pressured. It's unbelievable. So I've spent a lot of time with soccer players, and we've been researching how they live. And what I found was very different to South African rugby, I won't say any teams in South Africa, but soccer in general. South African rugby kind of takes care of the player very holistically. So they're very much into making sure that the players have got their families involved and how to deal with this ridiculous, violent, vicious animal called social media. They have all that support. And then soccer, on the other hand, kind of needs to man up a bit. Pardon my genderism there, but they really do in terms of giving the boys support for soccer. And I've only realized that since we worked on the show. We're a telenovela, so we're telling a dramatic story about, and we're making up stories, but all of this is kind of based on research and what soccer players go through. So that's completely off the topic, but just to say that's why South African rugby kind of has done so well in the country, is because the support has been holistic with the players. Anything in life where there's a team, and you kind of learn that when you get older, is far more rewarding than when it's just the one person and the ego that grows.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Where I want to get back to is just chatting about, we chatted a little bit about being South African Indian and our parents and, forefathers kind of making their descent. Specifically in your case, like, what do you know or understand about your own forefathers and how they made their way from India to South Africa?
So my mom is with me this very hectic period of shooting for these 2 weeks. I double checked with her if I was correct. My lineage came from the 1860s, and it was my grandfather's grandfather. So I'm fifth generation South African Indian. And then I'll tell you something that backfired, and I think then we didn't explore that, because everybody has that at one stage. You're going to find your lineage in India. So one of my uncles who married into my mom's family, so kind of like a distant uncle, but he did the whole research, and he went and he traced the family in India and, kind of found out who they were. And initially it was awesome. He had found relatives, and he wasn't a well-off guy. He was kind of like, in teaching or something that wasn't paying, he wasn't a businessman or anything. And then it kind of backfired, because then there was a huge dependency from finding his family in India, and he had to constantly send all copious amounts of money, which he couldn't afford, because, he felt bad about it. And then we were trying to, well, I wasn't, but I was privy to some of the conversations saying, it's not your responsibility, but you went over and traced. So ashamedly, I haven't done that and went traced where we got in. I do know that I'm South Indian. You could see it by the speed in which I talk. And funnily enough, my son, so there are some things that are just genetic. He speaks so fast. I'm like, when I looked at him the other day, I was like, where have I seen this? And then I was like, oh my gosh, it's actually from the South Indian movies that I've seen. This guy is doing it in English. I'm like, slow down. Nobody knows what you're talking about. And then I have thoroughbreds, right? What do I mean by thoroughbreds? I was Krijay Govender, and then I married a guy who was Krijay Govender, which, by the way, is completely frowned upon in Zulu culture and Xhosa culture. You really never marry somebody with the same name. And I constantly, I joke with everybody. I was like, our families have so much money. We just wanted to keep all the money in the family. So I married my cousin. But we did do the research when we first met and couldn't find really any. I'm sure at some point somebody is related. We couldn't find any relationship. So my kids are thoroughbred Govenders. I don't know what that means. And then on my dad's side, so I'm not completely Indian. My dad's side, my grandmother was colored. So my grandmother on my dad's side was colored, and the Padiachis, Mr. Padiachi married a colored woman. So my dad's mom has got colored blood in her, and we've never we should have traced that a bit. Peter Maritzburg coloreds, and so then I'm 1/8 colored, and then the rest of it is South Indian. So what I have done though is that I'm very much into a mixture of modern and antique stuff, like in the way in which I decorate my home, for example. So is that I've constantly asked for all the furniture of great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents because it's very outdated stuff. And then I've included it in my home and obviously refurbished some things. But I've got my husband's great-grandfather. He used to work for Shell, and I've got over 150-year-old Shell container. You know, he worked as a laborer for Shell, and that's kind of up on the wall. And then one of my husband's family also had a spear, and my husband's grandfather was called Dingaan as a nickname because he had a spear. He was obviously a very violent man. And I have his spear. And everybody that, you know, nobody wanted it, but now that it's up on my wall, when you can come home and you walk through. So what I've done is kind of not really looked that far into the past to India, but we don't know enough about our great grandparents. And those are the stories that haven't been told properly. You know, I know Rajesh Golpi wrote a play that I was involved with called Coolie Odyssey, and we got into a lot of trouble because of the name of the show. But if you came to watch it, it was what they were called. So historically, you know, he was trying to say that's what it was called. And other than that play and a few other writings, I would love to say everybody's reading, but nobody's reading, you know. So the fault really is on me and filmmakers who we're kind of caught in a really difficult situation, you know, because I'm very much into telling South African stories and making sure that I embed myself in the culture in the country that I live in. So that's why most of the shows that I do are in Zulu and Xhosa. And I don't know when last I've directed anything in English, but there's also every now and then I feel there's a huge responsibility beyond just us talking and people looking at those old pictures, you know, those black and white pictures, you know, with the turbans and the sari and the Grey Street pictures, the downgrade, everybody knows us. There's a responsibility on us to make more content on that. So big kudos to you for doing this, because you're doing that in some ways and you're telling those stories in some ways. And then I think it's also very important for it to go into film, you know, for us to. But as I said, like I find that myself, I don't have the bandwidth to do those stories and also to reflect my South Africanness and make sure that I'm not boxing myself as a South African Indian only, but as a South African.
Yeah, and I mean, completely understandable, and thank you for that. But yeah, that's pretty much why, like, I also feel a little bit sometimes, you know, I'm very proudly South African. Like, I identify as a South African, and I think it's only since moving here I've identified more strongly as South African Indian because of, you know, interactions and stuff, and just looking for community.
Yeah, it's not just that. It's something that, you know, I mean, I teach a directing class and I speak a lot about our identity of, it's not just that. It's because when people look at you, right, it's we all know that visuals are 80% of where you get your information from. So when they look at you, and particularly you, Alicia, and you've got a red dot on, so straight away people think India. But honestly, if I look at you and I can see that you don't have the frizzy hair and you have better hair, I can see, you know, South African Indians just have a way with their hair and their swagger. Yep. All right. We walk very differently, and I can spot a South African anywhere from the way they walk.
Yeah.
Irrespective of what their color is. So even traveling quite a bit, I mean, I always say to my husband, "That's an Afrikaans person." And he's like, "No, I'm telling you, all we have to say is water, and then you watch." So you don't blame people because what they see brown skin, which they associate with India, and so. I think it's very important for us then not just to, I won't say educate and inform, but to engage with people to go, there's more to me than just that identity. And, you know, I think Michael Jackson had it perfectly put when he said, "I'm not going to spend my life being a color." That's a line from one of his songs. It really resonated with me because I was also getting tired of saying, "I'm South African Indian, I'm South African Indian." So I think it's very important for us in different spaces that we are to show people the multifaceted identities that we all have. And you're right, being South African Indian abroad, you probably have to explain even more than anyone else.
I think it's explaining, but it's also the realization when you are abroad that that Indian identity resonates so deeply within you that you don't actually take notice of when you're in South Africa. Because when you're in South Africa, you're South African. You know, you do everything, you totally take in your surroundings, your culture, where you grow up, the people around you and stuff, and you don't really like look at those things from that Indian sort of goggles, if I could put it. But when you're away from it, you realize actually the food and the music and the movies and the cultural aspects of it, those are the things that you look for in order to feel that extra piece of home. So you get really excited when you see other South Africans, but you get just a notch higher level of excitement when you find South African Indians.
That's it, because only they would understand egg chutney.
Exactly.
Everybody else would call it shashuka. Only they would understand egg chutney.
Exactly. That's exactly it. So yeah, there are those things. And I do hope, in the future, we do find the movies and we do find even, the documentaries and stuff. Like I recently found a documentary that my mom sent to me because my grandfather was mentioned talking about football in the South African Indian community in Durban. And it's something that, that I'll also be sharing. And I really want to talk more about that because it was such a huge part of your life being a male in Durban, growing up in that era, is like, that football. And that's such a beautiful story.
My cousin is Natalie Rangan, and her dad was part of the Raiders. So there's whole, and every time we speak, because she's a musician, and she says to me, nobody knows, the story of the Raiders. And play a Raiders song, by the way. Just Google a Raiders song, and then you'll go, oh my gosh, so-and-so used to play this in their car. Because their Raiders, their music was not Indian, and it's epic. Their music is really, really good. And the Raiders was largely an Indian band. So yeah, there are those stories, and especially football. I mean, especially now with champions, and I'm constantly looking at football all the time. I'm going, wow, it's huge. It really is huge. So there's a gazillion stories to tell. And the good thing about living now is that it doesn't have to be $1 million movie. Can be done on streaming. It can be done with pictures, and it can be done using the internet.
Yeah, I think it's exciting. It's an exciting space to hear these stories because what I'm enjoying, doing this podcast and speaking to people more is realizing that the stories that actually feel wholesome and that you want to hear more about and that you're so intrigued by are the stories that actually have nothing to do with the struggle. It's the real life stories. It's what life was actually like and the things that people did growing up and adapting and as they changed and evolved into the South African Indian and, lived a life, not just lived for survival, but lived a life here.
Yeah. And I think the word that you used there was very important, which was adapting, because you can't get away from the struggle because the struggle is always a backdrop of, your socio-political environment is always going to be your backdrop. But the adapting to survive and to thrive in that space is where motivation comes from and is where inspiration comes from and is what we I'm sure you must hear this from your if you're speaking to your mom in South Africa, and it's we're in a little bit of a quiet depression.
Yeah.
We're all trying our best to kind of uplift ourselves with little events and celebrations, but really we are in a bit of a quiet depression in South Africa. And so those stories are now needed now more than ever, and that's why I kind of stepped away from comedy in recent years, is because I was going, okay, as a comedian, I'm kind of just joking about very frivolous, and I was kind of all the comedians in South Africa were hitting the same note, which is as a Black South African, as a colored South African, as an Indian South African. And of course, TikTok does it better as well. So kind of stepped back and I said to myself, I'm not really saying anything new. And unless comedy's got to be funny and enjoyable, but it's also got to be relatable and then just a little something to make you think about things differently or to make you aware, for example, if you're South African Indian, we're a really warm community, But there were elements of racism there. There's different, levels of racism. And I found comedy was a great way to kind of address that and just say, hey, but listen, check yourself. Let's check ourselves, And so I think bringing it back to what you were saying, it's really important not to tell the stories, but to show the stories in the various platforms that we have and to make it entertaining so people can digest it. And then all of us have got the most ridiculously short attention span. Like being in the television and film industry, I watched Oppenheimer and I went, guys, great film. Oh my word. So long. I watched it on a Monday morning with 3 other couples and I was all alone because just, for movies like that, I know not to take my husband because there's no Marvel characters jumping around. So I went and watched it by myself on a Monday morning. 2 of the couples were making out, which was great. They didn't watch the movie and the other couple left. I was the only one that watched it. And my point here is we need to make things digestible for people.
Agreed. And I think while we're on the topic of storytelling, there are some stories that I would like to hopefully get out of you. And those stories are taking us a little bit back into time with you as a teenager, because you have all the wisdom right now and all the growth and stuff, but you were once a teenager. And I think I would really love to know the things you did as a teenager that probably gave your parents some gray hair.
Yeah, I was a very manipulative teenager. So I don't even think my parents were aware. So I learned at a very early age that, and this is advice to everybody else except my teens, because I kind of know the game, that if you want to get away with murder in the South African Indian community, keep your grades up. That's all. Because that's all parents really cared about. So I was a really good student, but by default, I wasn't an A student by any, but I was a really good student. I was very involved and I was head girl and all those other accolades that mean nothing anymore, I think. But it was important back then. And I had that going. I also had a clown business on the weekends. So I was a very non-problematic child in that I didn't need money from my parents. I was kind of making money on my clown business. And then when you looked at me, I played a lot of sport and a lot of that. But when I was in Standard 9, which is grade 11, I had fallen in love with my neighbor, which is a very South African Indian thing to do if you lived in an Indian community, which we did. I had fallen in love with my neighbor, and he was my world at that point. I really was in love. I don't recommend it for a grade 11. And now when I look back, there's a lot of, if you ask me if I have regrets in life, that is one of the regrets that I had. Not that I fell in love, but I fell in love, and I had no idea what love is. Yeah. But I used to do a lot of sneaking out and in and out and in. I think my parents, up to this day, my poor dad has passed on without knowing that, and I'm very grateful for that. So I was really a horrible teenager in that I think the more horrible teenagers that do the things are far more honest, but I kind of had the facade of being a nice...
So living a double life almost.
Absolute double life. And all my friends, I remember Valentine's Day, my parents bought it, which is really sad. And I'm sad that they didn't know that I was really not that honest. Like Valentine's Day, getting these hideous teddy bears. Now, when you just look back, I once brought home a pink panther. And I said to them, oh, my best friend Ishara gave it to me. And they took it as face value. And something else that I did, which I could go to jail for if it happens now, is that I used to steal road signs. But there's a lot of creativity in this. So, Alicia, I know that your name is spelled A-L. Do they call you L? I used to go and buy the road sign book, because now you can Google. Yeah. Find out where the street was called with a name Alicia in it, or A-L-I, or A-L-I-S. Make a plan, okay, with no vehicles or whatever. Get a lift and all of that, and go to that neighborhood, climb the pole, rip that sign off, and give it to you for your birthday. Personalize road signs. Started right there. But on the other hand, I knew the limits. I kind of knew the limits with, and I kind of say that to the girls, because now I have to very, very vociferous, loud, over-opinionated teenage. I mean, I sometimes sit there and go, God, I am paying for all my sins, so my parents don't have to feel bad. Just very opinionated, and they opinionated on everything, and I go, okay, but you girls, this is it. This is where you need to know this is the limit. You know what I mean? And also, our parents never really had discussions about subjects like sex and all of that with us. And I understand because it was a far more conservative time. Mm-hmm. And I also find that a bit difficult to do with the kids. And I don't know who is right, whether finding out for yourself or by your friends is the right thing to do, or having a discussion with your parents. You know what I mean? Yeah. But I'm a really, really firm, strict mom. I really am. And what I have is this thing over here with the Find My Phone plus the Life 60 and all of that. And you know what it is? Not to justify my position of being a very strict mom. I know our parents would have said that the world's changed then, but the world's changed now. You know what I mean? And I've had to have a really good conversation with the girls who kind of want to put all their political views out in public. And I've got to say to them, hey, you need to get visas. Do not put your political views out in public.
There's consequences.
There's huge consequences. You know what I mean? And like most South African Indian parents, you want the best for your kids. You want them to travel. I mean, the opportunities that all your listeners on your podcast have. And so, yeah, I was a very naughty teenager, but I was also I've got all my friends from high school. The besties are still a part of my life. You acquire new friends. Best friends from universities are still a part of my life. So, but I wasn't a goody two-shoes, but I kind of knew where the line was. And I think the line right there, it was definitely God looking up, because I could have crossed the line and got into big trouble a lot of the time. But I kind of always had this voice, and it wasn't my voice. I always think that it was like God saying to me, okay, that's enough now. Time to pull it back. So, yeah, and I had a lot of fun as a teenager. I really did. So I kind of understand the difficulties of that, and I kind of give my girls space to kind of also do that, but not without a very, very big eye on them, which they are aware of or not. And I'm really good because of directing, because I always say that actors are a lot like children. You've got to treat each actor differently. You've got to applaud them. Some actors work well with applause, and some actors work well with like just reprimanding them. Mm-hmm. That works for kids as well. So, yeah.
I think that's really good. I mean, it's important to have those, teenage memories and stuff to look back on. And it was a different time. But what I wanted to find out as well, were your parents as strict as you are now, or were they just gave you the freedom?
Not at all. I don't think they gave me the freedom. I think my parents were very involved. My mom never says this to people. And that's the one person I really like to show off about. So my mom was the first Black in the sense of being, the word non-white is not a great term, but Black in the broader sense of being female computer programmer in South Africa. So she was focusing on her career, and my dad kind of was starting a business and he was kind of like a self-made guy, didn't go and do a business degree or something. He just worked as a clerk and then decided he was going to buy a truck. So he got into trucking. So my parents were very involved in kind of getting their own life, but they were parents that did very unusual things. So when I was 7 years old, for example, I remember we were very average in terms of where we sat. They were just kind of making ends meet, but they always made sure. And I never went to a public school. I never went to a private school. I went to a very public school. But my parents made sure that the opportunities that we had. So I was saying that when I was 7 years old, I remember a fond memory of going over Victoria Falls in a private plane because my dad was doing some missionary work there. So I had really unusual experiences with my parents working and becoming new Christians at that point, which opened up an entire world to us that we wouldn't have had. And they've always been parents, which I wish I could be more of. So I say to my friends, my mom is such an optimistic woman that if I came up to her right now and I said, Mom, I'm going to build a spaceship and I'm going to just Elon Musk my life up, she would go for it. She's never ever been the person that said, did you think of this? Did you think of that? And nor did my dad. They always say, if that's what you want to do, then go for it. But my dad would kind of every now and then, and there was no sitting down with words of wisdom, none of those things. But when you cross the line, like, writing articles in the newspaper that he wasn't excited about, because firstly, it went against, in his mind, our religion, which is what grounds us. And secondly, it kind of goes against what we are as South African Indians. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Nowadays, I feel that we've all become kind of Dr. Phils, or everyone wants to give you, every time you speak to somebody, they want to advise you. Sometimes they just go, and if you ever say to somebody, oh, I'm trying to lose a few pounds, whatever, the next minute, your phone is just going crazy. Oh, listen to this. And sometimes you go, I just want to have a conversation. I really don't want advice.
You just want to voice it.
That's it. You want to voice it. And my parents were great that way. They didn't really give us advice like that, but they really created opportunities, like sending me to the US after school on Rotary. And now when I look back, remember, the only way we communicated, and that was 1993, the only way we communicated was letters. It's not like now, you land. I never phoned. I would write a letter. So they were very brave, and I appreciate that from them, that they were very brave. And I wish I could be more like them as a parent, but I'm a little bit more conservative.
Well, like you said, the world is changing, so it is completely understandable. And that's where we leave the conversation for today. Be sure to tune in for part 2. But until then, shop sweet and aware. Lots of love.